Greetings, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. Here I am at 24 Chester Square in London, an area called Belgravia. You can see the blue plaque there. Well, that is where Mary Shelley spent some of the latter part of her life. She lived in many addresses around London. She travelled extensively around France, Germany, Italy and Switzerland as well. But a lot of the addresses she lived at in London no longer survive. So she is famous for being the authoress of Frankenstein, which has been made into a film so many times, who's one of the most renowned imaginary characters of all time. So Mary Shelley, she was born Mary Godwin here in London in 1797, grew up in an area called Somers Town. Her father, William Godwin, was a radical pamphleteer, publisher, owner of a coffee house, who was perennially in debt. He was renowned for publishing a work entitled Political Justice. So he was a radical. He had open disdain for monarchy, the notion of blood aristocracy, the established church, and sort of sweeping political change. Thought that this war against France at the time in the 1790s was not morally justified. He admired the French Revolution, saw it gang awry quite a bit. So Mary Godwin's mother was Mary Wollstonecraft, who was also the mother of modern feminism. So Mary Wollstonecraft is the one who published A Vindication of the Rights of Women, because it was shortly after the rights of man and of citizen was proclaimed by the French Republic. Because 1789, the French Revolution, had been only a few years earlier, France even deigned to grant the right to vote to women. Though the French, they soon had second thoughts about that one and retracted that entitlement, or deprived French women of the right to vote. So it was a time of sweeping political change, and Europe was in tumult. But obviously soon the French Revolution degenerated into Napoleon's megalomania and military dictatorship. But so it was only 4 weeks after Mary Godwin's birth, her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, died of postpartum complications. She's interred at St Pancras Old Church in London, which still stands. I believe her grave is lost. Anyway, her mother had a very controversial reputation. I don't want to talk too much about her mother because she led such an unconventional lifestyle. So seen as really harem-scarum. She'd had an affair with a married man. She had a child with out of wedlock and things like that. Late 18th century London wasn't that judgmental, but in the Victorian era this was reassessed. Her biodata wasn't that well known until a full-scale biography was published, and then she was thought to be totally immoral, and people became very puritanical and said, oh well, she was absolutely filthy and decadent, so we can't possibly learn anything from her preachments. But back to Mary Godwin, the daughter. So she grew up in an intensely political household where there were probably more books than money around. Her father's perennially in debt, which was a very serious matter in those days, because of course until the 1820s, debt was criminal. People went to Marshalsea prison, like John Dickens, father of Charles Dickens. They went to Newgate prison, and you wouldn't be let out until either your creditors forgave you or the debt was paid off. Well, you could earn a living in prison if you had a trade or profession, if you're a doctor and no patients are coming to see you, if you're like a leather worker and made wallets or something and people were willing to come buy them, you could live decently in prison. If a man was sent to prison, his wife and children could come with him for the right price. So the guards were very corruptible, and there was no rule against them taking these payments in order to give you a good life in prison. But if you were impecunious, then your life in prison would be hellish. Anyway, the Godwin family only just managed to keep the wall from the door many times. So there was not much schooling for girls, but she was a very erudite girl, largely autodidactic, Mary Godwin, and she was moving a radical circle. She spent some time in Dundee with the Baxter family, whom Godwin admired for their radical political notions. But when she was about 16, she became an admirer of this troubled young poet, Percy Bysshe Shelley. Life at home wasn't happy. There was never much money. Her father had remarried when Mary Godwin was 4, and she had a very strained relationship with her supposedly wicked stepmother, and Shelley seemed to offer a way out of this fairly maudlin situation at home. He came from an upper class family. His father was a Whig MP, no less. Anyway, Godwin got wind of his daughter having this romantic liaison with Percy Bysshe Shelley, you might consider it a small obstacle that Shelley was already married, but Godwin did not. Now, if you're a middle-aged father, would you consider a 22-year-old married man a suitable boyfriend for your 16-year-old daughter? Probably not. But he thought that Percy Bysshe Shelley was a very good option because he was wealthy. Though Percy Bysshe Shelley had fallen out with his family, they cut him off without a penny. He was in debt himself. He was the eldest son. He was in line to inherit the baronetcy and all the patrimony. So there's another thing. In the meantime, Godwin thought, well, I know the reason people are extending credit to Shelley, because his family, when push comes to shove, they will not allow him to go to jail. They will pay off his debts. And, he also, Shelley said that he would help Godwin financially with his magazine. But eventually, Shelley was unable to make good on that promise. Godwin was a bit hacked off about this. But finally, they began meeting in secret, and the father disapproved, Mary, Godwin, and Shelley. There's an apocryphal tale that Shelley took her maidenhood on the tomb of the mother in St Pancras Old Cemetery. That one doesn't have the ring of truth to me. There you are. Is that how you'd imagine your first time? I think losing your maidenhood in your mother's grave is a trifle unpalatable. Anyhow, but soon she was pregnant, and Shelley's wife was not pleased about it, as you can imagine, and so Shelley began living with Mary for 2 years, and eventually his wife Harriet Westbrook, by whom he had 2 children, couldn't take it. Now, there is a theory that Harriet Westbrook was having an affair with an army officer who's considerably older than her. She'd only done this when her husband had abandoned her, said, well, if he's going to take a mistress, well, I'm going to take a lover too. And then her lover was posted abroad, he was sending letters, and that Shelley's first wife, Harriet, moved address. The former landlady wouldn't forward the letters, so she thought she'd been jilted by her paramour as well as her husband, and Harriet Westbrook went to the Serpentine, a big pond at Hyde Park, and threw herself in and drowned in 1814. However, that meant that Shelley was free to marry. By this time, he had a child with Mary Godwin, and indeed she was pregnant with his second offspring by her, so indeed they wed. They had 3 children together, only one of whom survived, a boy. So they travelled very extensively around France and Germany, into Italy and Switzerland, because 1815, that 18th of June, the Napoleonic Wars were finally over, the Battle of Waterloo. It was safe for Britishers to go to mainland Europe. Most of it had been either France or French satellites, and so any Briton who set foot on French-occupied Loam was liable to be interned as an enemy alien. But it was no longer the case, so they could finally go on the Grand Tour. And that's for upper-class youths. We used to travel around France, soak a bit of culture, and the Romantic Road in Germany, perhaps, certainly into Italy. That was very much in the cards. Reading the muniments, if they could, and just visiting the ancient ruins. Go on to Greece, see some monuments there. If they were people of exceptional hardihood and very venturesome, they might go as far as the Holy Land, we'd now call that Israel and Palestine, to Egypt, to Turkey, particularly to Istanbul, but they had little interest in the Islamic heritage of that area. They wanted to see the Hellenistic ruins. But they didn't go as far as Egypt, the Holy Land, or indeed Turkey. But they were in Italy. And so there she heard lots of German folk tales, and that inspired her to put pen to paper. She wrote very extensive journals about her peregrinations in Western Europe, but she also wrote Frankenstein, or the new Prometheus. Now, who's Prometheus? We don't have much classical education these days, so Prometheus is a figure in ancient Greek mythology, and the gods don't want to give mankind the knowledge of fire, because this will empower the human race overmuch. There were titans. Titans were these mighty giants. But anyway, Prometheus, he broke the stipulation of the pantheon, and he gave the gift of fire to mankind. And the gods found out about this, and as you can imagine, they were decidedly dischuffed. So the obvious thing to do was to chain him to a cliffside, and he's on this escarpment for all eternity. And so he's going to be punished in perpetuity by some raven coming along and eating out his liver in the daytime, which is excruciating, and it grows back overnight for it to be eaten out again, and he never dies. So there's Prometheus Bound, an epic poem by Milton, I've got that right. Then Shelley wrote Prometheus Unbound, which is very lengthy. He wrote poems of several thousand lines. He wrote Queen Mab, best known about the Fairy Queen, the Revolt of Islam. Sometimes they're dramas, but completely in verse. So he's very prolific. But then Shelley had never worked a stroke in his life. It was easy to be a fabulous writer if he had to do nothing else but compose poems. He wrote scarcely anything in prose. Wrote a few essays, a vindication of the natural diet, about vegetarianism, though she wasn't vegetarian. A refutation of deism, why saying one thinks religion is nonsense. He wrote an address on behalf of the Irish people against the Act of Union, wanting it dissolved, and had been passed not so long before, so it seemed pretty impractical. The necessity of atheism, which he composed when he was an undergraduate at my college, University College, Oxford. But he'd rejected religion altogether. His wife didn't follow him in that, wasn't so firm on that one. She didn't seem to be believing Christian early in her life, but seemed to drift back towards Christianity later on. So Shelley was regarded as mentally deranged by many people for that. He was a very eccentric character, poets tend to be. So his wife wrote almost entirely prose, was not a poetess. She did compose a few verses, but she's not known for that. Anyway, so they were in Italy, and she spent a great time with Lord Byron. She met Samuel Taylor Coleridge. She met everybody who was anyone in literary London at the time, like Leigh Hunt. I'm just trying to think. There should be a few other names. Robert Southey should be popping into my mind. Anyway, so they're at Viareggio. John Keats, of course, who's died just the year before of tuberculosis in Rome. But anyway, they were there at Viareggio, and Shelley and two other Britons went out on a small boat, and the boat sank, I think, not capsized, and all three drowned. Quite how this happened is unclear. There wasn't a squall or anything. There is a rumour sometime later that some Italians later confessed that they deliberately rammed the boat, thinking this would enable them to rob the guys. But anyway, the bodies were washed ashore, and according to local regulations, they had to be cremated. I'm not sure why you need to cremate someone who drowned, and it was cremated on the beach because cremation was very unusual in Christendom back then. They thought it had pagan connotations, I'm not sure if she was actually in Viareggio. She's certainly in Italy at the time, but she didn't attend. Women usually didn't. It was thought that if she was pregnant, somehow being anywhere near a corpse might cause her to miscarry. So his ashes are interred, I think, some at the Protestant graveyard in Rome. So she came back here, and she never remarried, but she had relationships with a number of other men. So it was in 1818 that she published Frankenstein, which was a literary success, and finally made her quite financially secure. And that's why she was able to live here, but much later. So there were not many women who published books at the time. Remember, like say George Eliot, or actually Mary Ann Evans, wrote under a male name because ladies didn't write books. It simply wasn't the done thing. So she died in 1851, and she's buried with Shelley's parents actually in Bournemouth. So that is Mary Shelley, who published a number of other novels which ought to be read as well. So Frankenstein, well, I don't want to recount the whole narrative for you, but very brief synopsis is around that time, early 19th century Germany. There's some medical undergraduates, and can they bring back people from the dead? They thought they can have this Lazarus-like experience, not on themselves. We'll just do it to a cadaver because they're obviously dissecting them. And okay, we can amniotic fluid that will catalyze. What would we say? Bringing people back to life. An anesthesia. I can't remember what the proper English word is for it. Reanimation. But someone who's fully dead. Okay, not someone whose heart's just stopped for a minute. And indeed passing electricity through the brain, because we'd only just discovered what electricity was and learned how to generate it. Wasn't it Benjamin Franklin who discovered that some decades earlier? And so putting a brain into someone, but they accidentally put the brain of a delinquent in and not a good man, and then Frankenstein, this sort of 7-foot monster's going around with a bolt in his head and all the rest of it, but trying to be good and running away up into the mountains and kidnapping children, and can he help it? Yes, it's a fabulous, captivating novel. So don't rely on the film version. The film version's often not very accurate. There's a pretty good version, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein from the 1990s. So it certainly captured the public imagination, which is why it's been made into film so many times. Because as Dr. Frankenstein has the creature named after himself. Anyway, that's enough about Mary Shelley. Here we're on Chester Square, a very distinguished address where Margaret Thatcher lived, just up that way. It was Matthew Arnold, the poet. Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands lived on this square. I happen to know a member of the Saudi Arabian royal family, I better not say who, has an address very close to here. And a few other distinguished personages whose names escape me. Okay, toodle pip,